Ecocriticism, Literary Theory and Practice, presented by Hanan Mudaffar. This is part of a series of lectures on schools of literary theory and their application to literature. Both theory and application are taken from Rivkin and Ryan's Anthology to Literary Theory, with the articles on Shakespeare's King Lear used for the application. The presentation is enhanced with scenes from the 1975 BBC production of the play. Reading King Lear and watching the BBC production before starting the lecture would be beneficial. Literature has increasingly been approached not just as a fixed structure, but as a dynamic reflection of real life, prompting new ways of understanding knowledge itself. Writers like Alice Munro illustrate how life is not static but constantly shifting and unfolding through lived experiences. Social scientists are moving closer to capturing this lived, moving reality, moving away from rigid system-based models that once dominated literary and cultural theory. For instance, Kathleen Stewart's quasi-fictional prose seeks to represent the fluidity and unpredictability of real life rather than formal structures. This broader shift in how literature interacts with knowledge sets the stage for rethinking even deeper divisions, like the one between subject and object. Following this new approach to knowledge, critical thought challenged the old division between subject and object, a division that has traditionally separated humans from the material world. In the earlier model, humans were seen as subjects observing a separate object world. Today, thinkers argue that humans are deeply embedded in material reality and cannot be viewed apart from it. The material world itself, including animals and even microscopic life, like bacteria, is seen as animated and interconnected. Cultural experiences, such as attending a Beyoncé concert, are now understood not merely as mental experiences, but as fully physical, chemical, and emotional realities as well. This rethinking of the relationship between humans and the material world opens the door to posthumanists and new materialist perspectives. With the collapse of rigid subject-object distinctions, posthumanists and new materialist thinkers have proposed that traditional boundaries must be broken down altogether. Categories like society and science, culture and nature, technology and physicality, and human and animal can no longer be really separated. Central to this view is the idea of relation. Things only exist through their interactions in space and time, rather than as isolated self-contained entities. Network thinking replaces isolated thinking with objects and events seen as processes constantly evolving rather than stable permanent things. This relational, dynamic view of the world finds historical support in alternative materialist traditions stretching back to ancient philosophy. Long before posthumanism, ancient philosophers like Democritus, Lucretius, and Heraclitus proposed materialist views and saw the physical world as dynamic and interconnected. They suggested that the world is not static but constantly changing, with all elements interacting fluidly. Objects were understood not as permanent entities but as temporary gatherings of material destined to transform and dissolve over time. This ancient lineage of thought now finds resonance with modern scientific theory about complexity and emergence, offering further evidence that dynamic relations rather than fixed structures shape the world. Contemporary scientific theory, particularly in complexity science and non-linear biology, offers strong support for materialist and posthumanist thinking. Complexity theory suggests that matter itself is dynamic, emergent, and unpredictable rather than mechanical and stable. Small quantitative changes in a system can suddenly lead to major qualitative transformations, such as consciousness arising from simple neural matter. This insight encourages scholars to see literature and culture as dynamic systems as well, setting the stage for new ways of thinking about literary value and development. Viewing literature through the lens of dynamic systems, scholars like Martin Meadows argue that the literary canon is not fixed, but is itself a complex, evolving entity. The canon adapts to shifts in aesthetic values and cultural priorities. A clear example is again Alice Munro, whose once marginal status has evolved into canonical recognition as literary tastes and values have changed. This understanding leads directly into broader considerations of identity as dynamic, ecological, and entangled with the material world. Building on the view of literature and life as dynamic systems, scholars have begun to rethink identity itself as ecological and symbiotic. Organisms, including humans, are now seen as part of environmental networks, with identity emerging from these entanglements rather than from isolated individuality. Humans are not separate from their environments. Rather, they are material networks whose existence depends on constant exchanges with the world around them. There is no clear boundary between body and environment, culture and nature. Instead, they are deeply intertwined, suggesting that our very sense of self must be reimagined in ecological terms. This idea naturally leads to broader reconsiderations of humanity and ethics. Posthumanist perspectives argue that humanity can no longer see itself as superior or distinct from other forms of life. Thinkers such as Giorgio Agamben, Bruno Latour, and Donna Haraway emphasize that humans are embedded within larger life systems and material relations. Humans must be understood as continuous with animals, ecosystems, and material environments. As a result, ethics must move beyond human-centered concerns and reconceptualize relationships among humans, animals, and matter. Ethics becomes about nurturing and respecting interconnected life rather than merely regulating human actions. These ideas also begin to reshape literary studies, particularly through new critical attention to animals. In this expanded ethical framework, animals emerge as an important critical focus in literary studies. Literature reveals how human and non-human lives are intertwined, challenging anthropocentric perspectives. A vivid example comes from Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, where the character Septimus Smith connects deeply with non-human life, such as the song of birds and the presence of a dog, rejecting the cold scientific rationalism represented by doctors. Through such moments, literature opens up new ways of seeing the world as shared between human and non-human beings. This shift in perspective also informs critiques of societal norms, particularly regarding disability. Disability studies, informed by materialist and posthumanist thinking, critiques the very idea of normal physical and cognitive standards. Disability is increasingly understood not as a biological defect, but as a social construct shaped by cultural expectations. Historically, ableism has often aligned with racialized and exclusionary ideals, such as those prompted under regimes like Nazi Germany. Evolutionary materialism suggests that all bodies should be seen as variations, not deviations from the norm. This rejection of normative standards fits into broader challenges to binary thinking and opens the door to materialist approaches in environmentalism as well. The ecocritical movement, emerging in the 1970s, redirected literary focus towards landscape and the environmental conditions of life. Writers and critics began to emphasize how geographical, ecological, and class factors intertwine with survival. A key strand, bioregionalism, highlights how communities and literatures are shaped by their specific ecological settings. An example of this approach can be found in Willa Cather's My Antonia, which portrays immigrants' deep connection to the land and environment as central to their identity and survival. The growing understanding that land, culture, and identity are inseparable leads to a final, crucial insight about the unity of culture and nature. In this final step, ecocriticism embraces the view that culture and nature are not separate spheres but are fundamentally intertwined. Words themselves, as part of culture, have material effects on the brain, physically shaping neural pathways. Social learning is essential to brain development, showing that human biology and culture are inseparably linked. Rather than viewing culture as an overlay on a natural biological base, we must recognize that culture is biologically necessary for human existence. This merging of culture and nature challenges us to rethink not only literature, but the very foundations of human life and knowledge. In The Autumn King, Remembering the Land in King Lear, the authors urge a shift from symbolic readings to ecological ones, linking Lear's unraveling to material exposure and environmental disorder. The play dramatizes how natural forces, storms, imagined cliffs, become agents of insight and instability. Lear's madness and Gloucester's despair are not internal alone, but shaped by ecological conditions and perception. Key scenes, Lear's storm exposure and Gloucester's staged fall, show nature dismantling human authority and revealing interdependence. Shakespeare's landscapes are not passive settings, but dynamic participants in the character's transformation. Nature, in King Lear, becomes a force of revelation, challenging illusions of control and positioning humans within broader ecological systems. These scenes become dramatic case studies of how environmental forces dislodge social order and awaken ethical vision. One of the most ecologically significant moments in the play comes during the storm scene in Act 3.
Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm. How can your houseless heads, your unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from seasons such as these? Ah, I have ta'en too little care of this. Take physic, pomp. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayest shake the superflux to them, and show the heavens just.
The article identifies this as a moment of material confrontation between Lear and the natural world, stripped of courtly illusion. As Lear exclaims, "Poor naked wretches, wheresoever you are," he moves from a position of royal detachment to one of solidarity with the dispossessed. The speech reflects his ecological humility as he recognizes that the world is not governed by status or ceremony, but by the material realities of exposure and need. His lines, "Take physic, pomp, expose thyself to feel what wretches feel," mark a radical shift in ethical vision, repositioning Lear as a figure who, through suffering, glimpses a more just, ecologically aware way of relating to others and to the earth. Here, nature is not merely symbolic, it is an active agent of insight, provoking Lear's moral awakening through physical vulnerability. The storm's force dislodges anthropocentric certainty, placing Lear, like the kingdom, at the mercy of environmental forces beyond human control. The second ecologically resident scene appears in Act 4, where Edgar pretends to lead Gloucester to the edge of a cliff, only to stage a fall that never occurs.
Here is the place. Stand still. How fearful it is to cast one's eyes so low. The crows and choughs that wing the midway air seem scarce so gross as beetles. Halfway down hangs one that gathers samphire, dreadful trade. Methinks he seems no bigger than his head. The fishermen that walk upon the beach appear like mice. And yon tall anchoring bark diminished to her cock. Her cock, a boy, almost too small for sight. The murmuring surge that on the unnumbered idle pebbles chafes cannot be heard so high. I'll look no more, lest my brain turn and the deficient sight topple down headlong.
Edgar's description of the invisible cliff, how fearful and dizzy it is to cast one's eyes so low, constructs an imagined natural world that dwarfs human perspective. The article highlights this moment as a powerful meditation on scale and perception, where fishermen appear like mice and things seem diminished. The cliff, though fictional, functions as a symbol of the limits of human understanding and control. It is a moment where nature, real or imagined, redefines human experience as contingent, interdependent, and fragile. This staged fall thus becomes a turning point, not only for Gloucester's will to live, but for the play's vision of the natural world as a space of revelation rather than domination. Through illusion, Shakespeare exposes truth that human life is embedded in and humbled by forces far beyond itself. In conclusion, ecocriticism dismantles traditional binaries between nature and culture, viewing them as inseparable dimensions of existence. It challenges anthropocentrism, reimagining ethics in terms of ecological interdependence. Literature is seen as a dynamic, evolving system embedded within material and environmental realities. Human identity itself emerges from ecological entanglements, reshaping concepts of individuality and community. Posthumanist and materialist perspectives encourage new ways of reading literary texts within planetary frameworks. In applying ecocriticism to King Lear, the storm and the cliff, the scenes of the storm and the cliff are seen to dramatize this entanglement. Nature becomes a site of revelation, not just background. Ultimately, ecocriticism offers a compelling framework for reading literature in an age of urgent ecological crisis, bridging aesthetic experience with material survival.